All right. It is 6:31 according to my clock, so I'll convene, and we do have a quorum. Thanks to folks for being here today. I'll convene our regular meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission for Tuesday, October 25th, 2022. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Any changes to it?
We do not have any changes.
All right. And then we have our agenda as presented. Item 2 is the public forum. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to us on pretty much any item they would like to. And Charles, you said we have Sharon waiting in the.
Yes, and then Sharon, we'll start with you. If you'd like to speak, you can speak. If not, then we'll have you here.
Hi, good evening. I just wanted to know, I sent a late email to Megan and Charles and Scott. I wasn't sure who was going to be there tonight, but the agenda item that has to do with the neighborhood code initiative, I didn't see anything, a packet for, regular people to look at. And I wasn't sure if there was something that I missed. So that's really just a question. I don't have any other comments to make, but.
I don't believe there is, but Megan or Charles?
Yes, Megan did send a response to Sharon, but just so everybody else knows, and just for your knowledge, Sharon, yes, this is an item that is for the commission's information tonight. There will be a future, much more work and a future amendment ultimately to support the neighborhood code initiative. But at this moment, this meeting agenda item is simply to update the commission on what work has been done and the sort of direction of that work.
Okay, thank you. I have one other question, generic question. I know that there's a conference that is going to happen early November about the missing middle. And I'd asked for a link, and thank Megan or Charles or both anyways for sending that to me. But I never got a response. So I didn't know whether there was an opportunity to just go to that one session. The whole conference, which I can't go to because I'm working, is like $175, and I only want to go to 45 minutes of it. And so I wasn't sure if there was an avenue that I could pursue to pay for that, but not pay the full amount, and or a contact. And so I'm asking that also because I'd like to understand that a little bit better, the missing middle. Thank you.
So apologies, Sharon, if we didn't get back to you. I thought we had shared some details that the conference that we were talking about and that we had offered to the Planning Commission to support their participation in is actually the Vermont Development Conference, which is something that's put on by White and Burke Development Advisors. So there is a session within that conference, as you noted, that is about the missing middle. And so I don't know if there are options to attend just one part of that. That's something that White and Burke would have to help advise on. But I actually think that you may find some value in tonight's presentation to kind of fill what you're looking for in terms of learning more about that housing topic. So unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that question, but hopefully tonight will help you.
So thank you, but you did point me to White and Burke, and I will pursue it that way. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Sharon. Charles, do we have anyone else?
We don't have anybody else who would like to speak tonight.
Okay, we'll close that item. Item 3 is the chair's report, and I don't have anything tonight. So item 4 is the director's report. Megan.
All right, just a couple quick updates for you. We've spent the vast majority of your meetings over the past year talking about some major zoning changes that came out of the 10-point housing plan that was announced last December. And just wanted to share that I think that the mayor will be providing more of an update on all aspects of that plan at the next city council meeting, which is on November 7th. So if any of you are interested in that update, just wanted to flag that for you, and really excited that tonight we'll be talking to you about the third of the 3 major zoning amendments that were part of that initiative. We've talked a little bit over the last year about some of the initiatives related to investing financially and setting up emergency housing, things like that. So just thought some of you may be interested in hearing those updates. Two other major work items that we haven't talked about as much here at the commission, but just wanted to share a status update on with you. We've talked a lot about the need to update the city's impact fee study and to do this transportation demand management study. We've talked about both of these things in the context of both our housing and parking policies over the last several years. So I'm happy to share that as far as our impact fee study is concerned, we have, in partnership with the Regional Planning Commission, started some of that work. They have started evaluating the transportation element of our impact fees and helping us update some of the growth projections that are the basis for our impact fee assessment. And we just, as of yesterday, actually closed the submission period for proposals to evaluate our other service area fees that we assess impact fees for. So we have 3 submissions from that request for proposals, and we'll be reviewing those in the coming month. But that work is finally, after a long time of talking about the need for it, getting underway. And then I think last week, Charles also posted an RFP for the transportation demand management study. So we'll be soliciting proposals for that work up until Thanksgiving. So if you know of anyone who you think would be interested in this, or who does work in this area, would be happy to have you help us circulate that. We'll make sure you get a link to that in the agenda or after the meeting. So just wanted to share those 2 updates with you.
Great, thank you, Megan. We'll close that item and move on to item 5, which is update on BTV Neighborhood Code Initiative. Back to you or Charles.
This is actually going to be a little bit from me, but mostly from Sarah tonight.
Oh, from Sarah, okay, sorry
yeah.
about that.
That's all right. We're really excited to have Sarah joining us and presenting a lot of her work that she's been doing, largely since she started with Burlington. So really happy to bring this to you. I'll just briefly tee this up. I mentioned in the director's report that this is the 3rd of the 3 zoning amendments that were called out in the December 10-point housing plan. And it was prioritized as an important policy that really helps us think about how the city's neighborhoods and the zoning for the city's neighborhoods can help us welcome more neighborhood scale housing opportunities citywide. So we're going to share the presentation that was a part of the workshop that you all were invited to last week to give you some context on kind of what this initiative is about, why we're calling it the Neighborhood Code, and some of the research that our team and our partner in AARP have started to do, both on kind of local conditions and thinking about Burlington specific details as we move forward with this project, as well as looking at other communities and learning from other communities' experience with what we largely refer to as missing middle housing. So I don't know if Sarah, you want to pull up some slides, and we have put together this presentation. It'll be kind of a longer presentation, but as you see from your agenda tonight, it's the only item, and we really wanted to spend some time introducing the commission to this topic and to the research that we've been doing so far to help us kind of tee up where we're going with this in the future. Are you having trouble sharing, Sarah?
I am. I've almost got it though.
Okay,
Sorry about that.
that's okay.
Happy to be here. I think this is my first time presenting, so there are bound to be a couple hiccups. All right. Can you all see this okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Looks great. So if you want to move into the next slide, actually, Sarah, I'll start just by briefly sharing a little bit about what is it that we're talking about when we talk about the neighborhood code, and often when you hear the term missing middle housing. Missing middle housing is a term that is used to describe a set of residential building types that exist between the single-family detached home and the large apartment building. On the next slide, you can see some pictures of this continuum, often in the form of things like duplexes, triplexes, cottage courts, or even really small apartment buildings in some cases. In the next slide, you can see examples of these buildings here in Burlington. We have lots of examples of middle housing types in nearly every neighborhood of Burlington. And one of the reasons why these homes are often referred to as missing is because throughout the US, and certainly here in Burlington, codes through zoning and other regulations around what can be built have often resulted in these more moderately priced homes becoming increasingly difficult to create in neighborhoods. We see, and as we'll detail throughout this presentation, that these types of housing have become harder and harder to create in many communities due to zoning constraints, shifts to car-centric patterns of development, and even in some cases, the challenges of financing certain types of homes. So you're going to hear a lot today about some of the research that we've done about where these housing types have existed in Burlington and what some of the existing challenges are to seeing more of these sort of neighborhood scale homes in Burlington. But I think it's important to note that we know that this housing type is not a silver bullet and will not solve all of our housing problems, but is a really important part of the housing solution. So as I mentioned before, we're bringing this to you as part of that larger package of other zoning changes that you've been talking about this year, and certainly building on the body of work that you've been doing over the last decade, really, with thinking about where and how new homes can be created in Burlington. So middle housing, and these missing middle housing types, are intended to help us address the mismatch between our housing stock and some of our housing needs, particularly around kind of smaller homes and more affordable homes, and ways that we can use our land in a more efficient way, our limited land here in Burlington in a more efficient way. So the first thing we're going to do is share a couple of slides that AARP and kind of technical assistance provider that they've worked with helped us put together to look at some of the changes in households here in Burlington and understand how missing middle housing types can help provide an opportunity for housing types that help meet some of our household demographics. But before we dive into this, I just want to note here that you're going to hear us say missing middle a lot throughout this presentation. And I think especially for people who are familiar with working in housing, that immediately brings up for them the idea of middle income or the missing middle in terms of an affordability level of housing. And while you'll see that there is a relationship between the income or the affordability level that these middle housing types often help provide, we are primarily talking about the housing types themselves, those duplex, triplex, small buildings that are of a neighborhood scale. The other thing I wanted to mention, I've said, and you saw on the first slide, that AARP has been helping us with some of the work that we'll present tonight. You may remember that several years ago, when we updated our zoning ordinance around ADUs, we heard a lot from AARP and organizations like HomeShare Vermont about the importance of accessory dwelling units to creating neighborhoods that are supportive of aging in place. And this work, looking at middle housing types, is another area that AARP is very supportive of. They recognize that middle housing types provide a lot of opportunity for older adults that are hoping to downsize, that may want to stay in their neighborhood, for age-friendly homes, for multi-generational living, and ultimately for more inclusive neighborhoods for not just older adults, but also other households in the city. So Kelly Stoddard-Poor couldn't be here tonight. She really wanted to be, but she did want us to let you all know that they are really excited to be supportive of the work that we're doing and are trying to help bring in other considerations into this work. So I'm going to turn it over really at this point to Sarah, who's going to walk us through some information about households and the history of our zoning and some direction on where we think this work will be going.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. And as Megan just talked about, just an overview about what Missing Middle is, I just wanted to provide some reasons why we think it would be a really valuable addition to existing housing stock in Burlington. These smaller units give more housing choices to people, and they also tend to blend in with existing neighborhoods, requiring less land because you're going to get more housing on each parcel, which then makes them more affordable, leading to more multi-generational neighborhoods full of residents with diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. And meaning from a city perspective as well, it can also expand the tax base, relieving pressure on property taxes. So a lot of really encouraging things that benefit individuals, families, as well as the city as a whole. So we don't want to be prescriptive of anyone's life course, but there are trends that tend to happen and indicate that housing needs tend to look different across one's life. Older adults may want accessible housing that's smaller and easier to maintain. First-time homebuyers might be looking for affordable entry-level households in a way, and there also might be a lot of single person or single parent households in Burlington that are looking for smaller units that are also more affordable. Looking at data compared from 2020 compared to 2010, data showed that Burlington saw a 5% growth in the last decade. When we think about missing middle housing options, really good candidates are often people in their early careers or folks renting or contemplating ownership, as well as older adults 65 and over, and collectively these populations in Burlington make up about a third of the population. This slide is really compelling, showing that the share of one-person households changed more than any other group between 2010 and 2020, with data showing that almost 38% of all housing units in Burlington are one-person households, with two-person households making up 34%, and overall Burlington having an average household size of 2.2. Echo Northwest also did an analysis on the housing price comparisons of different types of housing over the last 5 years and the area median income. And this chart shows that single-family detached homes were largely unaffordable for households earning 100% of the area median income in Burlington, in comparison to condos, where prices were more affordable in Burlington, with households earned 80% of AMI, affordable for households below 100% or 80% AMI within Burlington. The reason that we show this is that we often find that housing types are able to share costs of land and other expenses, and that help create more affordability, and why missing middle types have that kind of potential. Now, this chart relates incomes to affordable housing and provides perspective on what an area median income is and how it relates to what you'd pay per month on mortgage or on rent. The missing middle housing is one of the strategies that fills the gap for households that are in between that 80 to 120% AMI. And this meets the needs of really essential community members like teachers, for nurses and is a really important part of the income spectrum in communities. We also want to point out that it's important to look at household needs across that income spectrum and develop a variety of housing strategies. Like we all know, there isn't a silver bullet, just as Megan just said, and this work requires a great number of strategies to meet all of Burlington's housing needs for all of its residents and planning for all income brackets. And missing middle can be a type of housing that doesn't require as much subsidy to provide in a community to make it more accessible. And introducing the Burlington Neighborhood Code, the Burlington Neighborhood Code is an opportunity to be one of those strategies and meet those needs in the city. Also, shout out to Jody Whalen, the local artist who has done these really great graphics and of different housing styles across Burlington. So as many of you all know, as I'm sure all of you all know, we've been working at a number of reforms in recent years to support and implement our future land use plan, which is pictured here. Most of this work has focused on areas that are pictured in gold on this map on the left, and that have been identified as areas that can accommodate the most intensive future growth in the city. However, not all of these areas can or will accommodate housing going forward. There are also areas that we're planning for jobs, business, and for different public school sites. An area that we have paid particular attention to for the most recent years is downtown. But to put this in perspective, downtown only represents 2% of the city's total land area. And even as there are ways that we can grow within this area, they focus mainly on like larger scale multifamily housing. So the neighborhood code is about these areas that are in blue on the right, the 40% of the city that's in our residential areas, and how they can also be a place to allow for more and different types of homes. In Burlington, we all know that we have very strong connections to our neighborhood's unique patterns and architectural features that link us to the city's history and create a sense of place and the people that live within them. And they're also special to us because these neighborhoods can and should be places that support the needs of current and future households in Burlington and help us respond to our chronic and emerging housing needs and even make tangible efforts to address the climate emergency. In fact, Plan BTV recognizes the opportunity for neighborhoods to evolve in incremental ways in order to meet these needs, and the neighborhood code is about how we can do that. But we know that we have some limitations in place for being able to see our neighborhoods evolve to accommodate these missing middle forms of housing. In particular, of these areas residential areas we've been talking about, the vast majority, or 83%, is zoned primarily for low density development. And this is an important point to reflect on as we talk about how missing middle housing types can have that space in our community. In our research on this work and of the work of other communities and cities, we've reviewed a displacement risk, particularly in Portland, Oregon, and want to highlight a couple of findings. One of that being the research found that neighborhoods that don't allow for more housing opportunities to absorb that growing or changing population can increase gentrification pressures in other neighborhoods that then spills over, exacerbating inequalities across race and class lines. They also found that missing middle housing types, newer ones built in single family neighborhoods, were found to reduce the housing cost for the new missing middle housing types created due to smaller unit sizes and the ability to share land and develop costs across multiple units. For those of you that are familiar with Burlington's neighborhoods, at this point you may be thinking about the duplex or triplex in your neighborhood, or even a large apartment complex, and wondering how those could be there if we're talking about all of the barriers to their creation or to their development. And there are certainly quirks in our zoning today and changes that have happened over time that have led to the pattern of development that we see today. And the abbreviated history of how we got here was when the city first adopted zoning in 1947. At the time, we only had one residential zone that you can see in blue here, which allowed for a range of housing types to be built within it. And our code tailored some standards like lot size and building height to the housing types themselves, rather than to all development within the district. At the time that the code first went into effect, nearly half of all residential properties within our low density neighborhoods had already been built. But in those properties, nearly 80% were non-conforming to new requirements for lot size and lot width adopted in the 40s. Despite this, those early standards for our lone residential district, still that one singular district, provided flexibility for our lots that had not been developed. And it wasn't until the 1970s and 1990s that we started changing our zoning in ways that made missing middle harder and harder to build and even illegal in some cases. In the 1970s, residential zoning districts there were residential zoning districts that made distinctions in the types of homes that were allowed in different neighborhoods and were really limiting to most residential areas to just single family and duplexes. Only the green area in that western Old North End and immediately surrounding downtown allowed for multiple units. And in the 1970s, they also introduced the concept of density, limiting the number of homes on a lot based on its overall size, and started to really require parking spaces at every home. In the 1990s, we downzoned our neighborhoods, particularly chipping away at the areas of high and medium density, and required large lots in order to build a new home. We also introduced standards that incentivized building on the very low and very high ends of single family, of kind of like that spectrum, that single family home or the apartment complex, and really losing that in between. And thus, our ordinance made it harder to build that in between those middle types. So nationally, there was also a trend toward suburbanization and car culture. And this is likely an element or reaction to the growth of the Burlington suburbs and the city wanting to remain very competitive. And if we look further back, there were those federal housing policies that led to racial and class discrimination. And while Burlington was never formally redlined, zoning tools that were common across the country as proxies for this policy began making their way into Burlington's laws too. We also know that our legacy of urban renewal that affected how we thought about our historic or working class and immigrant neighborhoods and how we saw them evolve compared to these single family neighborhoods. And this evolution is not necessarily unique to Burlington, as I just mentioned with the auto-centric trend across the country. And our 2008 ordinance really made some important course corrections to some of those most important limiting policies. You may have heard of communities eliminating single family zoning, and this is not our focus here in Burlington, because for nearly 2 decades, Burlington has no longer had zoning districts that only strictly allow for single family homes to be built. And today, all residential districts allow for at least ADUs and duplexes, at least in theory, which I'll talk about in a moment. Again, this challenge is not unique to Burlington when it comes to how to enable a diversity of housing choices in neighborhoods. Communities are taking a range of approaches to address the most impactful policies in their context. We've seen it addressed in communities large and small over the last 5 years and beyond. Some of you may even remember hearing from our keynote at the Housing Summit in 2019 about Minneapolis's efforts to allow for up to 4 units in all areas of the city. And many West Coast cities have been relentlessly pursuing policy changes to address their housing crisis. Even here in our most rural states in the Northeast, Vermont and Maine have taken steps through changes to state law and through other incentives and technical support to help missing middle find its way back into the fabric of communities across our region. And from this work, we know that the number of common barriers, regardless of a community size. There are a number of barriers regardless of a community size. Sometimes we hear missing middle work described as an effort to make what's old new again. One common barrier is miszoning neighborhoods in ways that don't reflect what's actually been built. And that's resulted in homes and housing types that we love gradually becoming outlawed. Here in Burlington, 40% of properties in our low density districts still don't meet our existing zoning standards. And you can see how this impacts entire neighborhoods and clusters of historic development patterns, flagging them as illegal. As we dive into the neighborhood code, we'll be looking more closely at other reasons why these properties don't conform to our zoning today, and how we'll remove barriers that are preventing us from realizing more missing middle options. Some other common barriers include parking requirements that aren't sensitive to the size of the home, and another aspect is layers of zoning that unintentionally prohibit the housing types that we think we allow. And this is where that asterisk I mentioned, like that asterisk is relevant. While we, in theory, allow ADUs and duplexes on every residential lot, we know that building a new duplex may be unachievable for nearly half the lots in our neighborhoods. In the vast majority of these neighborhoods, lots have to be at least 10,000 square feet to accommodate a duplex. And that may be that's unachievable for many future builds, but because the median lot size in these same areas is about 8,000 square feet. And while we talk about the benefits of having more homes closer to schools, stores, downtown, having access to that public transportation, you can see that the majority of lots in the city that are big enough for a duplex are on the furthest ends of the city. Another common barrier is using density limits as a proxy for building scale. These are 4 homes in the Old North End that are all within a block of each other that likely used to be single family homes at one time, that zoning had allowed them to be converted into a duplex. Still very much at neighborhood scale. They look like they even have parking on site, and these really do all look within that same scale. However, if you tried to build the 2 on the right today, you would not be able to. The reason why is not immediately obvious when we think about the things that we observe that are contributing to neighborhood character, but this means that this is because the lots on that right side are very small. But the standard just doesn't really read to the average passerby as a barrier, and instead has the effect of encouraging larger buildings as lots get bigger and discourages those smaller housing options. One example of a case study that we looked at was in Durham, North Carolina. Many communities that have made changes to allow missing middle housing types have addressed this by making their zoning codes more sensitive to that overall size and scale of buildings. For example, in Durham, Durham proposed changes to the zoning ordinance that actually reduced some of the development intensity that was allowed in some of those neighborhoods, but specifically made it possible to create small lots and allow for duplexes in those single family neighborhoods. They adjusted the zoning in other areas of the city, such as along those major thoroughfares, to allow for bigger, more dense buildings, helping address housing cost and reducing the potential for economic displacement. Even looking beyond the oldest neighborhoods where missing middle housing may have historically been built, it can also be a tool for helping us use available land for more housing in parts of the city that are low density, by supporting infill that adds more housing but keeps a primarily single family home character. However, zoning often is not calibrated to allow a range of housing types or flexible lot configurations. This model shows how an acre single family home lot could accommodate 5 small freestanding cottages with off-street parking ample green space, and community amenities. And some key barriers to this are density limits and multiple density limits that require each lot to have frontage on a street, as well as parking requirements. Another barrier that I'll talk about right now is the difficulty for allowing multiple smaller buildings on those larger lots. And this is especially important where we have areas of low density zoning along major thoroughfares in Burlington that are zoned RL, such as Shelburne Road, Colchester Avenue, and North Avenue. And these are high frequency transit routes and connect major streets and areas of neighborhoods to commercial uses and a variety of mixed uses in their neighborhood to other neighborhoods. So this is a model of how surface parking lots within the steps of a bus stop and Hannaford Plaza could be repurposed into a 2-story, 4-unit building that's ADA accessible. I drive past this, or I take the bus past this every day. While you're sitting in that North Ave construction over there, I highly recommend turning to your right and seeing it. It could be ADA accessible, a 4-plex with off-street parking that is also next to a senior care facility and could provide possible worker housing. However, these key barriers are, again, density limits and multifamily units that are on that same lot with that parking requirement.
I think Sarah had asked me to jump in here just because some of these examples were things that we were adding to the presentation just before we started. So I'll just join here by saying that some of these conditions that Sarah just highlighted really point us in the direction of exploring the concept of some sort of form standard for our neighborhood areas. We have looked at examples of communities that have used this kind of tool to provide flexibility for how their zoning can allow for these types of homes and buildings using tools that are much more fine-tuned to be able to address things like building scale, building size, to help address the character and how new homes can fit within the character of neighborhoods. So this is definitely how the work was described in South Bend, Indiana. They described this as tuning their code to create zoning standards that were really specific to how middle housing types could be incorporated in neighborhoods, and actually described this as the elimination of the suburban bias. So helping peel back some of those zoning standards that just weren't even reflective of what was actually on the ground. And I think this is actually really interesting work because South Bend not only addressed this through their zoning, but took this a step further by creating incentives and technical resources to help support middle housing by creating kind of a modern day Sears catalog for new housing types. This is a pre-approved plan catalog that homeowners and small developers can take advantage of to access plans that fit within their zoning laws and are really tuned into the uniqueness of lots within their city and help move new homes in the direction of kind of what the community really wants them to look like. And they've provided some other incentives as well. We've also seen examples of this kind of fine tuning on the next slide in Memphis, Tennessee and Shelby County, Tennessee, coming out of a housing availability and affordability plan. They issued some recommendations for communities within their entire region to help them do some of the work that we've already done, like making ADUs more accessible within their communities, but also really understanding that there were opportunities to support more up through 6-unit developments within some of their key neighborhoods. As well as looking at those high frequency transit corridors, the North Avenues, like Sarah had mentioned, and looking at opportunities to expand smaller kind of apartment buildings and what we call like upper missing middle housing types in those areas. One thing I think that's also interesting about Memphis's work is that, like South Bend, they took this a step further beyond the zoning and also recognized that a major barrier to seeing these housing types also resided within their building code, and actually reformed their building code at the local level to allow for up to 6-unit buildings to be able to apply the residential code, the International Residential Code, instead of more of a commercial building code, which is a really important element in terms of making the cost of constructing these new homes more affordable in their neighborhoods. So is that all for me there, Sarah? Oh, okay. I guess I'll bring us home then, and say thanks to Sarah for walking us through all that research and background, and just kind of bring this back together and say that as we've been looking through these sort of issues at the local level and understanding how other communities have approached this work, we see several major areas that we will be addressing through our neighborhood code here in Burlington. As Sarah mentioned, one of the first things will be for us to look at ways that we can re-legalize historic neighborhood patterns. We often hear and talk about the fact that sometimes new development just doesn't feel like it fits in our neighborhoods. And so we're really investigating the ways that, as Sarah had mentioned, our codes really don't reflect what had been built historically, and understand better the reasons why it's harder to get those historic patterns. We'll also look for Burlington kind of calibrated solutions to some of the common zoning barriers that we see to having more of these small and middle housing types. We are really looking for opportunities to think about context sensitive zoning tools that will help us be able to build on that unique character of those neighborhoods as we welcome new homes in these areas. And we will also be looking at the scale of development that's allowed in areas of low density development or low density zoning along our major corridors. These are the same areas we've been talking about in terms of parking policy. You may remember the multimodal mixed use district really identified several corridors. We'll be looking to those same areas to see kind of what scale of buildings and homes we allow on those areas as well. So the goal for tonight, I think you all know we've told you about trivia a number of times. We're really excited and we hope you'll join us for trivia next week. But I think at this point, just want to say that the goal of kind of bringing this information to you tonight was to give you an update on kind of where we see this work going. But we also wanted to start just opening it up to all of you to hear your thoughts on what we just shared with you. And in particular, kind of what areas of this work you think has the greatest potential for Burlington, and maybe what areas of this work you see as potentially being difficult or having additional kind of considerations that we need to look into more as we get this underway. So I think we'll stop there and open it up to all of you for discussion.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Sarah. That was a really great presentation. Really appreciate it. So let's open it up. Commissioners, any comments, questions along lines Megan and Sarah just outlined? Michael?
Yeah, 2 comments. One, yeah, awesome presentation, really interesting. One thing that I've encountered that seems important to address, and it may just be part of, having the zoning code reflecting what's on the ground, is there are, a number of historic unoccupied properties around the city, like historic barns and things of that nature, where if you were to redevelop and this is even talking to Scott, if you were to redevelop them substantially, you fall into the setbacks and various footprint limitations that you have that are currently required of code, but that's problematic in a historic structure where you can use the actual structure. So that would just be one comment. And the other one, and I know it's all sort of baked in, is just, it seems like a great opportunity for home ownership, which is something we don't necessarily talk about a lot. And, to the extent it's relevant, talking to, I know VHFA, you're working with them and talking to them about potential barriers in the code towards home ownership financing. So.
Good, thank
Did
you.
the baby have something to add there at the end?
So her name is Felicity, and she's here. But you can't spell that without city, so that's the connection.
How old is she?
3 weeks.
Wow.
Is this her first meeting?
Yes, it is.
Awesome.
And she's awake.
Adorable.
And she's awake. So very excited.
She's very excited about middle housing. Yeah, great point about reusing existing structures, these structures to create more housing opportunities. I think that is an important point that we've also heard from talking to some folks in the preservation community, that they are really hopeful that this work can help inspire people to make better use of historic structures. And I know from our work on ADUs, one major thing that we were looking at was just the fact that in a lot of existing properties, you couldn't have an ADU because of the lot coverage limit. So I think that's something that we'll also see here that's relevant to that point. And yes, just wanted to respond. We have started talking with the Vermont Housing Finance Agency a bit about this work, understanding that they have some similar related initiatives. We mentioned at the top that we're not talking about middle income housing, but they are very much thinking about middle income housing in many of these same housing types that we're talking about. And one of the challenges that they've seen is actually what they call a value gap, where it can be more expensive to build these types of homes than what they could actually sell for. So they've been trying to come up with some creative gap financing solutions to help address that problem and make more affordable housing options.
Thanks. Anyone else? Bruce?
Maybe further to Megan's point, one of the things that you've seen is structures and people's taste for living units have gotten smaller. But in an area where we have dwelling units per acre, it's hard to make that work because a 4-bedroom dwelling unit is the same as a 1-bedroom dwelling unit or a studio for density purposes in many of the zones. So it seems like we'd be more well served to a device that gave us the scale we want, but not prescribe the number of units quite so like floor area ratio in some of these zones. The other thing that jumped out at me about the presentation is the building code thing. I think that's really important. I don't know where the threshold is, but everything I've ever tried to do more than 3 units has been required to be sprinklered. And when you talk about sprinkler, what that means in our city is, okay, we've got an antiquated pipeline in the road. You might have to dig down the road 2 streets to find the appropriate pressure, or you're talking about $50,000 or $60,000 probably, and a lot of uncertainty before you even get into the building.
Can't just dig a pond, Bruce? I see that Eves has his hand up, Andy, and then I'd like to say something.
Oh, sure. Eves, go ahead.
Thanks. First of all, great presentation. Thank you so much. And Andy, you're shameless. Is this her first meeting? As if she's going to make it a habit. I guess this is more pertinent. So I think Bruce just nailed it. The reality is that we can talk all we want about, what would be good to have and how nice it would be if, but at the end of the day, what we really need to look at is our regulatory environment and the costs that are associated with it, because unfortunately, it's as though we do have a tendency to speak out of both sides of our mouths because we say we want it, and yet we put obstacles in place all the time. So if you have a 600 square foot ADU you put above your garage, well, all of a sudden the fire department says, well, you got to sprinkle the thing, and that adds a cost that really makes it prohibitive. And until we address those, we can talk all we want, but the reality is that at this point, somebody said it, the cost of construction is higher than the value of the property. So you can say, I want to borrow $500,000 and build something, and then the appraiser will come back after the construction and say, well, it's worth 400. So until we address that, I think that we need to have a comprehensive look, I think, as a city at what we charge and what it's like in comparison to other communities who have been more successful than we have in developing this missing middle. And I guess the other question I have, which is less pertinent to sort of the scale of the middle housing, but more pertinent to the affordability of the middle housing, going back to the middle class, is I'd be very interested to sort of look to the sacred cow, inclusionary housing, and try to understand the impact that that's had on this. Because the reality is, if you go to build a building that has 100 units and you've got 25% inclusionary, that means that 25 of those 100 units, you're going to lose money on right out of the box, a lot of money. And there's only one way to make up that difference, and that's by making the other units more expensive. And so what you do is you create polarization. There's affordability for the those who have very little, and there's affordability for those who have an awful lot. But the middle gets completely lost. And I really do think it would behoove us to sort of at least dust that off and say, is it really working? And is it creating what we want? If it's not, how do we make it better? That's it.
Thanks. Anyone else? Emily?
I just wanted to share that I've got, I live in residential high density in what's considered a student neighborhood. And what I've noticed over the last 10 years is that there's been several people who have moved to the neighborhood who are retirees. And one of my neighbors, actually, she is from Atlanta, Georgia, and she's in her 50s, and has an office job in Atlanta, Georgia in finance. And she worked with her management. Her husband's retired, and she worked with her management to be able to work remotely. And they live in a 1-bedroom apartment in Burlington, and they downsized like a big family home with 4 bedrooms in Atlanta, Georgia, and moved here. And she is just like, they are so happy to be in Burlington and be living in a small apartment right downtown. It is like, it's just been their dream. They love the lifestyle. They love walking places. They love having a small apartment that they don't have to maintain. So I think a lot of the time when we talk about building these smaller units and just building in general, people automatically assume, oh, that means that students are going to be moving to my neighborhood, or poor people. And I would offer that there's actually just a lot of people who are in transition in their lives and are choosing to live in smaller units and want to live downtown in a walkable community and have access to all like the amenities that we have in Burlington. So it's not just students who are using up these apartments.
I just want to say thank you for pointing that out and bringing that up. It's awesome to have AARP also partnering on this and bringing up that more informal relief of social isolation for older adults, and that walkability and that access to more, doctor's appointments, easier access to transit. It's just so huge, and just the just social determinants of health and aging. So I appreciate you bringing that up and pointing it out.
Alex?
Sarah, thank you for a great presentation. That was very helpful. Emily, I think you should lock down the video rights to your neighbor's story. I think that might be useful. Listening to this, thinking about it, we talked about form-based code for a long time, but what this is a little bit mind-blowing for me, because we spend so much time erecting, sort of defining what you can and can't do with your property, and what housing types or what building types we'd like to see, but we're trying to blow that up a little bit and make it easier to build something that's not there because we've made it too hard. So it's really it's a cliche, but the paradigm shift for me to think about it this way, and I think it's a little bit exciting. And the other thing I'm thinking about is, how do we talk about increasing density in residential low density? And that is a very difficult proposition, and one that's going to have to be undertaken carefully. And I'm sure that Megan will be good at going to public meetings and talking about it, and probably needs to be led by the mayor and the city council. That, you want to do what to my land, especially in places that have been developed since post-World War II, like the New North End.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think if we think back to the slide that Sarah shared, where we showed 4 identical houses in the Old North End, it's a good example of how density and the way that we've used it and the way that we think about it does not necessarily translate to what we actually want to see on the ground. We have used things like the combination of lot coverage or setbacks or density limits as a sort of proxy for having a more sensitive tool to help us see housing types that are of the scale and size and kind of shape that we really prefer to see in our neighborhoods. And I think what we know is that it hasn't always resulted in the types of things that we would like to be able to replicate. So I agree with you, Alex, that it is a huge paradigm shift. And in most cases, actually, I think our residential neighborhoods are one of the few places left in the city where we actually have density limits. And I think that will be a difficult conversation to have, but I think we'll be able to look to examples of other places that have successfully said, you know, here are the type and scale of buildings we want to have, and density doesn't matter as much as long as we have a code that helps us get these things.
Tuning is a good word.
Tuning is a great word. Yeah.
Julie, sorry.
No, it's Julia.
Oh,
You got it
Julia,
this
I
time.
got it right. I did get it right.
Yep. Thanks. That presentation was great. And it would be great if we could go back to some of those really rich slides with information about the progression of the different districts, density districts over the years. But Alex brought up some of my thoughts about the new North End and how this is, I think, an important conversation throughout the city, but will need to be a different conversation in places like the new North End, you know, relative to other districts. And I think, you know, it'd be great to discuss as a group, just the average building age and the way that this will impact, like, you know, what we would think of as visually compatible in a particular neighborhood. And I thought the example that you provided, that rendering of the new North End, that in sort of a cottagecourt style, would be really powerful for somebody to see, because maybe, you know, people have seen that missing middle diagram somewhere if they're engaged in planning at all, or they're familiar at least with different housing types in Burlington that we would call missing middle, but they might not be familiar with how that could really look like on the ground in a much more suburban low density neighborhood. So I just thought that was really exciting to me, and I'm excited to see people's response to that in the future. And I think one big opportunity that the city has with these changes is education about this housing type, and, you know, the information's all here. So I'm really excited to see where that goes. And then I also wanted to underscore the importance of having those different demographics supported by different types of housing on a block. I've lived in 2 places in Burlington, and my first neighborhood had, you know, the greatest variety of folks on that street because it was full of missing middle housing types. So I think, like, it's a real phenomenon, and it's really valuable in terms of making neighborhoods welcoming to many different people, regardless of their backgrounds, and also just creating like a really cohesive place, I would say. So some thoughts there. Yeah, so I was interested, there was so much information. It was really good. I didn't absorb all of it, but there was something I would just love to hear more about, the nonconformities and how they have changed over time. If you could just reiterate that.
And definitely, and Megan, I don't know how much you want us to dive in tonight. We have done an analysis of the parcel conformity of existing parcels for each of these zoning ordinances. So showing, and we have I think this is a lot of information. We have a ton more coming your way that we can definitely go into. But the main things that I looked at and was able to kind of map out were with the lot size, then, you know, dwelling units per acre, frontage. We would have loved to do more setback focused analysis during this, but because of some spatial, just some like risks of spatial inaccuracy, we didn't go ahead and do that. But yeah, just mainly looking at those dimensional requirements and dwelling units per acre, all based on location, whether it fell within or outside of certain zones. And as you can kind of see, that fluctuation of the western portion of the Old North End really did impact throughout, I think, the 70s and the 73 and 94 ordinance. It really kind of fluctuated different levels of conformity. So we do have, all that to say, we do have a larger analysis based on neighborhood character kind of coming your way.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add a couple quick points. Sarah, maybe if you want to go to the next, I think it might be your next slide, a couple slides. When you show the this one, I think is really interesting because this really looks at just two zoning, two aspects of zoning, I'll say, which are lot size and lot frontage, which is essentially the width of a lot. And I think why these two standards in particular are important is because for a lot of properties in the city, they've been platted essentially once. And so this is one of the easier ways for us to understand kind of where our zoning may have been out of step in the first place when it was first adopted. So these properties that are highlighted in red here, a lot of the properties that had already been built at the time we first adopted zoning didn't conform largely due to those standards. Actually, we're looking at the wrong one, but you get the point of what I'm saying. I mean, even today, we see that a lot of properties pre-existed our zoning standards in terms of lot size, or even the number of units that are on a property. So this is the one I think I was talking about before. You know, that we just see that often, as Sarah had said, we're requiring much larger minimum lot sizes in order to have a residential property, period, than what we actually see in reality. We have some neighborhoods of the city that have lots as small as 3,000 or 4,000 square feet. And this is something that we had actually dug into quite a bit in our ADU research as well, and really found that even while well-intentioned, we had very few lots in the city that would allow someone to build an ADU because of some of these standards. And I think we're finding those same kind of barriers to be cropping up again when we talk about these other housing types.
Just a quick question, is that the Lakeside neighborhood that like most of those lots don't meet the minimum size, but that's...
So the areas that you see in red are actually, so you have some neighborhoods down, we call the Five Sisters in the South End. We see the Birchcliff neighborhood in the South End. The sort of largest square of red parcels, the furthest south end is the Addition. So this is like between Home and Flynn Avenues. The area, actually a lot of the eastern side of the city around the institutions this is an area where there are very small lots in the city. And you can even see like our post-war suburban development. Some of the most affordable homes, you know, even in present day, are on smaller lots than what we would require for someone, in this case, to have a duplex.
Julia, anything else?
I think this is great. I'm really excited that we're talking about this and thinking about just one last thing about density prescriptions, you know, a minimum, if there is to be some sort of prescription for that, like a density minimum, it makes more sense to me personally.
Anyone else? Oh, Michael, I can't tell. Is your hand up?
Yeah, just a quick thing, Megan, I can't help but think about the new North End long-range plan as we look at this and undertake what is culturally a, maybe a shift. Just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think I appreciate Julia bringing this up and others. I do think that we will find that as we move through this work, it'll start to dovetail with a lot of other projects that we are doing. So Michael mentioned the new North End plan. I think as we start to identify potential solutions for zoning, that work will also give us a forum for having a conversation about what are the right ways to fine tune the zoning in that part of the city for these housing types. And then I think coming back to a point Eve made earlier about the kind of overall cost of development, I think, I mentioned at the top that we are taking on our impact fee study. And we are also working kind of at the same time on an analysis of some other economic, there are some other economic analyses that are being performed about the city's taxation policies, land use patterns, et cetera, that I think will also help inform us on the economic feasibility of some of these housing types as we move forward. So definitely dovetails with a lot of other work that's going on.
Great.
Thanks,
Yves?
Megan. Thanks, Megan.
You're welcome.
Yves, your hand is still up. I'm not sure if you still want to speak or if you just still up before. All right, Bruce.
One thing I'd like to add to what Megan said and what we talked about with sprinklers before, sometimes it's not the cost. We tend to look at the cost, but the other side of the equation is if I had a triplex and if I had one more unit, then I could sprinkle the building. So sometimes there are opportunities to get both a safer building at a cost spread per unit that makes an additional unit make sense. And I think in this area, we tend to sort of think only about cost, and it's not just about cost. It's more like cost per unit in many cases.
Yeah, and I think so Sarah and Charles have heard me talk about this, so sorry for both of you to have to hear this again, but Charles and I are just back from a planning conference in Maine last week, and I attended a session that was amazing in terms of that exact point that you were just talking about, Bruce, that was an exercise in actually taking a real property and trying to fit a real triplex on it and understanding how all of the zoning rules conspired to make it very difficult, if not impossible, to put that triplex on that property. And the kind of final step in that exercise was to take some numbers about land cost and development cost and actually do the math and translate that into what would the units in this building actually cost if you could build them. And it demonstrated sometimes that like when we have conversations about one more unit, maybe not fitting in a building, it could actually be the make or break point for an entire project, or the make or break point for all of the other units in that building to be affordable to someone or not. So I think there are also some other things that we might want to have you all kind of work on over the course of this project, and particularly have some conversations about with the community too, just to help us translate this into real numbers and real circumstances here in Burlington.
Megan, I think that last point that you were just making of what you did at that conference last week is really going to be critical in this process, which is think about the things that we would like to do, we'd like to be able to do, and match it up with our code, the existing code, whether it's the zoning code, the building codes, whatever else it might be, and see what are the barriers to being able to do that. And I think that process that you're talking about of just, imagining different scenarios and working your way through that is going to really lead to, I think, some really interesting discussions, some really interesting places, and highlight where those barriers are, because they're certainly there. And another point that I know I've used this example in the past and I've discussed this in the past, but it really seems like this is the opportunity to do something like this. I use the ADUs as the example, which is when the city first started allowing them I think it was before 2008, but when they first started allowing them, it was looked at as not a good thing, but a bad thing. And so, the city begrudgingly started to allow them and put in a lot of restrictions and limitations to how you could have them. It almost, at the time, I think the city felt like it was kind of being forced to allow ADUs. That thinking obviously has dramatically changed since then, but there may still be some legacy barriers that were built into the code when those were developed that would still make it difficult to put in place. For example, I think it still needs to be like an owner occupied for part of it. And I think that's something worth looking at is why? Why does an ADU, one side or the other of it, have to be owner occupied? Are there ways to accomplish the same goals that would otherwise allow for? But some of those things are just like artificial barriers that are put in place, and going through all the different scenarios, going back again to where I started, all the different scenarios of things that we might like to see in our city. Can we do that? And if not, why not? And what needs to change? So I think that conference you went to last week might really be invaluable for this process.
Why we like to go to these things.
Bruce?
One question I'd always like to ask is, do our zones make sense for the built environment? On one side of Pearl Street to the south, it's RH in most of the area, and the other side, it's RL. Does that make sense? And there are a lot of places like that throughout the city. And, it's not just about lot by lot. Oftentimes we only think lot by lot. It's about the zone.
Alex?
I just wanted to mention, we don't have Sarah's slides up anymore, but somebody, maybe it was you, Megan, mentioned the one slide that showed the effect on the ground of like, it was 4 different houses in the Old North End that had varying levels of density. I thought that slide was really effective in communicating, like all of these structures look the same from the outside, they feel the same, but they accommodate vastly different numbers of people. They might do it well. I don't know what they look like on the inside, but I just thought that would be helpful.
Well, I think the other piece of that is that those structures not only look very much the same, but they actually probably accommodate similar numbers of people. But our zoning ordinance treats some of them as illegal and others as perfectly acceptable. So while all else equal, it was really the point that like sometimes a really small lot could mean that something we like wouldn't be allowed. But yeah, thanks for calling that out. I think you're right that is helpful at illuminating a barrier that most people wouldn't even think about.
So it's a different way of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Julia?
I just have one other thought to add about like missing middle and infill. And I think missing middle might not be something that people are familiar with, but people are probably familiar with the term infill and would prefer it to greenfield development in a lot of cases. So it's just something I wanted to add to this discussion.
Well, I think this is going to be a really good discussion we're going to have in the months to come, and really looking forward to it. So thanks for this introduction, although we have been introduced to it before, but thanks for this reintroduction. It was a really good discussion. Thanks. And with that, we'll close that item and move on to item 6, which is commissioner items. Any commissioner items? When is our next meeting? It's in 2 weeks.
No, the next meeting is November 15th. It is your only meeting in November. And a few things on that. Megan will be away, but attending virtually. And we have the public hearings for the South End Innovation District and Trinity campus amendments. And we're expecting that those will be the 2 items on the agenda, and will not be adding anything else to the agenda unless, Andy, you'd like to. And then, yep, we'll regroup in December.
Okay, good. Any other commissioner items? Right, item 7 is minutes and communications. There a motion to approve the minutes, and accept the communications. Motion by Julia, seconded by Alex. All those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand. Any opposed? We have our minutes and communications. And finally, item 8 is motion to adjourn. Is there a motion to adjourn? Or just
Approve.
a motion by Alex. Great. And a second by Emily. All those in favor of the motion to adjourn, say aye, or raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? We stand adjourned. Thanks. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
See you in a few weeks.
See you.